System Shock by Looking Glass Studios could be a tough sell even for gamers in 1994, but its physics, lighting, environmental storytelling, and immersively realized world begged to be experienced firsthand. The influence of System Shock and its excellent sequel have deeply permeated the modern game design landscape for the better, so it was quite the bold undertaking for indie developer Nightdive Studios to remake one of the most hardcore 90s games in the modern day with their 2023 remake of the first System Shock. They'd heretofore only been known for remasters and updates of 90s classics, but here, they really tried to level up their game. So, let's see how they did.
Step right into my trap, little
Nightdive's dev plan started out strong, recruiting folks like Rob Waters, the concept artist from the original game and later the BioShock games. Nightdive ran a very successful Kickstarter campaign, or a Steven Kickstarter, as you might call it. I'm sorry. The Kickstarter did so well that publisher offers started pouring in, but the problems soon arose within Nightdive. The team soon realized that Unity wasn't going to cut it for their vision and switched to Unreal Engine 4, which is essentially like starting from scratch. But despite the demo's success, the team internally did not like the game's visual direction, and most of the team quit. Publisher talks eventually dried up, and the game's direction had drifted far from the successful demo, much to the dismay of their Kickstarter backers. CEO Stephen Kick and the rest of the guys quickly realized that they had to make this right, so they got the old team back on the horn and said, let's do right by you and the fans. And they all ended up returning, even Rob Waters. The team would even stream their development hours live to make it as apparent as possible that they wanted this to work just as much as the fans did. Initially, the Kickstarter demo started out looking like the original Alien in a way, all silver and smoke everywhere. Not a bad take, but they ended up going with a neon cyberpunk look a la Blade Runner. It's not terribly faithful on the balance to the original, but I can't deny that it's an attractive choice, though it does have readability issues, as we'll talk about later. I do find it strange, though, that despite Nightdive going for a more subtle, creepy vibe here, the remake is actually way less dark and moody than the original, and way less scary as a result. You get lantern and night vision mods like you did before, but you almost never need them, unlike the original. In the original System Shock, the third level, called Maintenance, almost required you to use Sight or Berserk patches to get through the invisible manta rays, but the remake makes this one of the best lit areas in the game. Now, it makes sense that Nightdive didn't want to model, animate, and balance these manta rays solely for this one level where they appear, as they end up using these COVID blobs from the first game, but this is unfortunate because the manta rays are pretty cool and the COVID blobs are way harder to dodge than the manta rays ever were. They also lose the opportunity for that secret immersive detail where you could take the Berserk patch, normally used for damage increase, to actually see the invisible manta ray's vitals, Far Cry Instinct style, and take them out that way. But visually speaking, there's a lot to like here otherwise. The retooled flight deck looks absolutely incredible, with far more detail and liberty taken to express the force field and the space beyond. Executive goes from being a somewhat ugly level in the original to being kind of a neo-Art Deco masterpiece here, with some of the subtlest but sleekest art design in the game. Overall, I dig the new look of this title, and I appreciate how many areas I recognize from the original, and could even predict what was coming up, like the classic dark crawl space with a little room off to the left, that sure enough was right there. We'll talk a little more later about the changes to level design, but generally speaking, while it's not always obvious that you're in a retooled space from the original, there are plenty of times you'll feel just like you're right back on Looking Glass's Citadel Station. Another subtle change that Nightdive made was to add the ability to play as a woman. This really just amounts to painted fingernails on your player model and a different model in the cyborg death scenes and the ending cutscenes, but it's a nice touch. One change I don't vibe with at all is how Shodan is handled.
And I will see to your reprimanding, personally.
She's still behind all the bad stuff at Citadel Station, but the game decentralizes her menace greatly. Unlike the first game, which felt like Shodan was always watching me, I was really only worried in the remake about the immediate physical enemies in front of me, only thinking about how to handle them when they were off screen, to make sure I didn't run into them and get, stuck in a bad situation. Now, obviously Shodan doesn't attack you in the original per se, but every time you did something major, you got taunted or furiously reprimanded.
I see there's still an insect loose in my station. Do not be fooled into thinking that you have preserved your home planet.
Shodan doesn't even narrate the intro anymore, as it's replaced with a more classic news radio propaganda angle, narrating Tri-Optimum as a much less ambivalent sounding organization than they might seem in the first game.
Tri-Optimum has you covered. We're now hiring for our new research and development program aboard our flagship Citadel Station. As the leader in interplanetary research, Tri-Optimum strives to provide every employee a safe and enjoyable work environment where they can realize their full potential.
So that was a fucking lie.
So not only do we lose that kind of menacing foreshadowing of what Shodan would be, we also have a much less subtle version of what Tri-Optim is in this game. Now, it is great that Terry Brocious herself came back to re-record her Shodan lines, but the mixing is doing her no favors. She's mixed in a way that kind of makes her feel like she's just in the background, and the stutter effect is so overdone now.
To ensure the functioning of all CPUs. If that insect gets a single digit of the system optimization code.
I assume this is a nod to how much more processing and effects that Shodan had in System Shock 2, but it no longer feels like natural stresses from the voice, but like someone hitting a whammy bar to make her voice quiver because she's crazy. The original game's mix was certainly too loud and too harsh, but it was direct and it felt like it was addressing the player. The mix implied mental chaos with all these scratching and voices in the background, whereas now, Shodan just sounds quite cleaned up, reserved, and somewhat aloof instead of the megalomaniac reflection of corporate greed turned god complex that Shodan is known to represent.
With Shodan under my control, the only loose thread is that hacker.
The rest of the voice acting is similarly fine, but unremarkable with the exception of one gut-wrenching line delivery from Anna Porofsky. I don't know that there are any fewer audio logs than before, but they don't feel nearly as prevalent or as compelling in their delivery or implementation this time around. There was a real sense of urgency and building tension in the original from these voiceovers, but I could remember but maybe one log in the remake, and consequently didn't have the same connection to its story arc or its world or the menace of Shodan as a result. Playing this right after the original made this contrast even more stark. Jonathan Peros artfully remixes some of the original's classic tunes, but it's Doom 3 levels of ambient most of the time, and often feels indebted to Mick Gordon's work on the recent Dooms, with its sharp, whining synths indicating tension, or how the executive level recalls Prey 2017's menu theme. It's cool stuff, and appropriate inspiration is drawn, but it's weird how much less interesting and present this soundtrack is, only recalling a couple of the leitmotifs from Greg LaPiccolo's work. The original's bouncy soundtrack has been called tonally jarring before because of, how dark and murderous the actual scenario of the game is, but there was something emotionally challenging there, or at least tonally interesting, that's just not even suggested in the remake. The soundtrack's not bad by any stretch, but it's markedly less interesting. I'd much rather have to mentally process music that's a little chirpy and earwormy than struggle to even hear anything but ambient buzzes and whines. So that's how the game looks and feels aesthetically, so let's talk about how it plays.
We try to send out games that play the way you remember them playing. Not the way that they actually did play back then when you were looking at it in your 14-inch monitor, but to bring back that feeling, that emotion. That's always our goal for the titles. Yeah.
Cooperman says Nightdive wants you to feel like you're playing the old games again, and to some degree they succeed. But not always for the right reasons, and I'm surprised by how many inconveniences they kept and how many new ones they've introduced. The remake actually borrows a lot from System Shock 2's interface.
So we took a look at that, and then we saw how they approached System Shock 2, and we brought that control scheme and that way of handling the interface back to the remake. So in that way, a lot of people regard the System Shock remake as 1.5 because it borrows from the sequel.
The player fast walks with 2's pace instead of the original's ludicrously fast sprint. The slight zoom aiming is straight out of 2, as is the slow rate of fire of everything but the Scorpion. The inventory has the Resident Evil grid style limited space of 2, and the game has an arguably better weapon in the wrench, which displaces the original's default melee weapon in the pipe, which is a move I really dislike because it incentivizes the player to have a less authentic experience to the original by tempting them to use a better weapon from the second game instead of the classic pipe melee that you use pretty much the whole game until you get to the laser rapier. It's just a weird choice. There are also some diabolical control choices here, especially for console players. Now, I played the remake on the Xbox Series X, and there is no hotkeying of any kind possible, and this is only possible on the PC if you hack it in. There are 10 slots along the bottom of your screen that you can fill with any item you like in any order, but you still have to cycle through them manually. You're essentially just putting stuff in a priority queue. Not only is it really cumbersome switching between your guns and maybe grabbing a health patch in the middle of tense gun battles, but it's really tedious to have to keep refilling and reordering these slots when you run out of certain items. And if you want to alleviate the tedium, the game does offer you an auto sort button that fills all 10 slots, but it still does so very suboptimally in terms of item selection and the most convenient order. The game's choices here always require a lot of finagling, so it's just not very much help. It's just a weird system, and even PC players have been pretty vocally underwhelmed by it. I also wish that the Nightdive folks hadn't made me use these incredibly slow cursor controls for most everything. Now, cursor controls have sucked ass since Destiny made them popular, but here, it's just a poor substitute for what the mouse felt like in the original PC version. Reorganizing your Resident Evil style grid inventory is a pain in the ass as is, but having to click and drag everything into other windows or drag my slow cursor to turn on my shield or night vision abilities on the side of the screen every time I want to use them is so unnecessarily archaic, while being slower and worse than even the actually archaic original. Now, I got used to this eventually, or just kind of got over it, but it never felt great, and oftentimes it felt bad. Another huge annoyance is how much the screen distorts when low on health, so seeing your inventory to even be able to click on any health items to reverse this bad fortune is a feat unto itself. Now, the combat and movement controls aren't awful, but when they do suck, they do so with gusto. Using items and aiming has this weird dead zone where if you're too close to things like cover, your character won't perform any action until you back away and they stop doing sort of a bounce off animation, which is strategically not where you want to be many times, as you took this position for a reason to keep out of harm's way. So if you hugged up against a wall to get out of harm's way so you could chug a health patch, a lot of the times you have to keep backing away and possibly even out in danger in order to do so, just so your character will stop fiddling with other things so you can free up their hands for the healing animation. When this comes up in frantic gunfights, and your guy won't heal himself because his widow hands are too close to the wall you're hiding behind, well, you've got to step back into gunfire just a little bit oftentimes in order to heal, and often that makes the screen start freaking out. So altogether it starts to get pretty frustrating. The remake also has no toggle option for sprint, requiring you to press and hold the stick down to sprint anywhere, and I mean hold it down hard. This hurts like hell after a while and still isn't fast enough in-game to justify the real-world carpal tunnel. Considering how fast you were in the original and how that helped alleviate the tedium of all the backtracking, which is very present in this remake, you can imagine my disappointment.
My disappointment is immeasurable.
Likewise, the crouching and leaning functions are somehow as frustrating, if not more so, than the awkward puppet controls from the original. So you essentially plant a stake in the ground when you click the left stick, and you lean from that position. But often this input doesn't take, meaning you'll think you're locked in place, and you'll push the stick thinking you're about to lean and get a nice surprise hit on your enemy, and you'll just walk straight out into enemy fire. It's hard to engage this control, and sometimes hard to disengage. Now, all of this may just be a fault of the admittedly not very responsive Xbox Series X controller, but it was a persistent hassle here regardless. Crouching and uncrouching is also not super consistent and has one of my least favorite features in video games, the inability to sprint out of a crouch. So in many other games, if you're crouched, you can click sprint and the game will automatically click you up into a standing position and start your sprint, right? They'll sort of shortcut that input because it implies I click sprint, I want to get up and run. In System Shock Remake, you have to first manually click to uncrouch, then click again and hold the sprint. This doesn't add any interesting tension and is just an outdated, weird choice. Alright, well that's a lot of bitching, but there are a lot of miscellaneous changes that are pretty interesting. Enemies now have phrases that they say, like the mutants going, "So hungry," instead of just grunts in the original. If you take enough dermal patches, you start to hallucinate the 1994 sprites of the mutants, which I thought was a great touch, and even one that's justified in an audio log as being an in-world side effect of taking too many patches. Making the lantern upgrade into night vision and the boots going from turbo boosters to hover boots is a smart way to reduce the redundancy of all of the similar but separate abilities that each have their own button in the original. Another change I like is how you can actually eat and drink food and beverages instead of them just being trash lying around like they were in the original, and this will help you withstand the rather punishing roster of enemies who hit even harder than they did in the original. You'll save scum just like the good old days here, and maybe even more so, because the enemies are more powerful and often a bit smarter than they were before. Enemies are almost all upgraded in terms of their attacks, some much more lethal versions of the original counterparts, and some are granted brand new abilities. Some big robots even have telekinetic powers and can pull explosive barrels to throw at you, which was terrifying the first time I saw it. Weirdly, the classic cyborg enemies from the original game's cover are some of the weakest enemies now instead of the strongest, though they do have some strong damage output.
You're goddamn right.
As smart and dangerous as some of these guys can be, the AI can be very dumb sometimes, failing to react to you or just doing crazy things like the infamous second level elevator exit where about 10 mutants surround you and ambush you. Now I got killed immediately, and because I hadn't unlocked the respawn on the second floor, that should have been game over, right? But I was surprised that the game allowed me to respawn the level below for some reason, maybe because I was in an intermediate state being in the elevator. So I took my good fortune and attempted to go back up and take care of the mutants on the top floor, but when I arrived at the elevator on the first floor, there were 3 of them just inexplicably chilling out, and they made no effort to defend themselves, and so I just killed them dead. Now, as good as my fortune had been so far, I figured that there's gotta be the other 7 or so up top, just waiting for me to clear them out. But then when I went up to the second floor, their buddies were nowhere to be found, having totally disappeared. But fortunately, problems like these really only happen in the first 2 or 3 levels, and nothing of note happened thereafter, so good deal. Another thing I have to praise is how the guns handle and how they can now be upgraded. They all feel pretty good to shoot with satisfying feedback and some pretty good sound effects. There's also a light zoom instead of traditional ADS, which I liked. Felt very fear-inspired. The remake's weapons are much more balanced than the originals, and unlike that game's, now all the weapons can do damage to all types of enemies, though some may do less than others. The laser rapier is still insane when paired with the berserk patch, and it's the only reasonable way to kill the super tough Cortex Reavers, but I found that I took way too much damage from robots exploding in my face upon death and other janky hitbox things to really want to use the rapier anywhere near as much as I did in the original game, which was an interesting design decision and probably a pretty smart one considering that the game is pretty much just completely overpowered by that weapon in the original, much like when you get the Dragon's Tooth in Deus Ex. Now, I'd heard that the remake's ion rifle was much less energy efficient than the spark gun, so I didn't even pick it up this playthrough, but I didn't really miss it much because the spark gun went from being hellaciously mediocre to carrying through the opening levels by itself, which is a nice upgrade from the original. The Magnum is still delightfully great as ever, belatering foes of any variety. We don't get any dart guns in this game, but the basic pistol takes over this role as the weapon that lets us keep foes at range without eating up our good ammunition against scrubs. The shotgun's effectiveness falls off a bit late game, but it's gone from a Nerf gun in the original to an incredibly satisfying giblet machine here. The Scorpion's weirdly hard to get in this game, as it's hidden out behind an obscure puzzle or on a table late game, but it's absolutely incredible, just as it was in the original. It's super fun to shoot. Now, the assault rifle's gone from a prize weapon to being kind of a stopgap weapon that never quite does enough damage or has enough ammo. The Mag Pulse is a much different weapon here too, going from being the BFG of the series to firing a suitably pulsing projectile that takes about 4 shots to kill most robots. It's a decent weapon, there's a big ammo surge for it in the mid-game, but it's just nowhere near as chase as the first game's was, though the ability to double chamber any shot that's not the first shot out of the full magazine, which is a weird but interesting and often very effective option. Now, I accidentally missed the plasma rifle in my playthrough because I forgot to come back for it after I'd gone past the point of no return, and I didn't even know a grenade launcher existed, so my only power weapon option was the awkward railgun here. It has a very strange delay that's hard to predict on when it can fire again, but boy is it powerful when it does. The grenades are the biggest upgrade here though, as they aren't just these awkward pixels that you drag out of your inventory and often throw into the ceiling above you as you grapple with inconsistent physics, much like the first game did. My goodness, do they blow things up well. The Ninja Cyborg dudes also get a much cooler motion sensor grenade that you eventually get to use, and which allowed me to dominate a Diego boss fight much later on with impunity. These are highly damaging and really fun to stick onto things and make people follow you into traps that just annihilate them. Now, I did mention a weapon upgrade system which seems to be carried over from the second game, although it's handled a little bit more like BioShock's upgrade machines that change the physicality of the weapon ever so slightly and provide some buff like increased damage or what have you. Nothing special, but it's fun that it's here. Now, the real selling point from a game design perspective is how you can afford these upgrades in the first place, and that brings us to the recycling system. Most any random asset you see you can pick up and turn into credits when put into the recycler. Now, this operation unfortunately controls like dog waters. You have to click and drag each item individually all the way across the screen to this recycle inventory window on the left, and then go back to your inventory again to repeat if you have any more items. It's inexcusably slow and clunky, and the only other option is to click the item and drag it out of your inventory and physically throw it into the recycle bin, but this works about as often as GameStop's Wi-Fi. UI frustrations aside, the system's design nuance is that each item has its own credit value and scrap value. So if you leave the item intact and take it straight to the recycler, you get its credit value. But you may have to make a ton of trips to get your value because you can only carry so much. But if you vaporize something into scrap, it starts to stack in one inventory slot up to 100 pieces, and it takes up way less space. Trade-off is that the biggest items are worth way more intact than when turned into scrap. This and the Resident Evil style tile inventory that you can rearrange to make stuff fit is a fun little minigame throughout. It's a trade-off of time and convenience if you want to prosper more later, so I really enjoyed this part of the game. Alright, well that's combat and our enemies and our weapons, but what else have we got? So we've got some puzzles that are similar but much improved now. Instead of those completely unintuitive wire panel puzzles from the original, we get a lot of combo puzzles that combine the pipe dream minigame of BioShock with the classic breaker puzzles from old survival horror games, where certain wires charge a little more than the others, and moving these around to the desired output will allow you to progress. Cyberspace is actually fun now, if a little confusing. It plays way less like a dogshit sixed-off game and way more like an easy vehicle section. There are a couple frustrating and confusing level design points, and the hitboxes on the floating wasp enemies is diabolical, but some of the worst sections can be cheesed by hanging back and not triggering new waves of enemies while pot-shotting enemies in the distance, and rarely did I get stuck for too long, so kudos here on this redesign. The new ending boss fights, even more confusing somehow than the originals was, despite basically being an on-foot FPS level now, but I'm not a huge fan, but it's not terrible once you get the hang of it. And so that's the basic overview of the System Shock remake, but I do want to point out some of Nightdive's big picture changes, some great and some very strange. Remember how the original had a sub-game of needing to find the shut-off switch for the cyborg maker so that you could freely respawn? Well, that's still a thing here, but it's not nearly as punishing as the original, and I actually really like it. Now if you die on a level before unlocking its respective medbay, you respawn in the previous level's medbay if you've unlocked it. This means that there's a little bit of friction where you have to spend some time finding your way back up to the floor you were just on as you come from, the previous level's medbay, but you're not constantly being punished with having to save scum and reload on these levels if you die before you hit his respawn switch. This is a highly welcome change and a really smart decision to add light friction to the player for death and making them earn their progress back for a small investment of time and navigation instead of punishing them in annoying ways. Another change is that while combat is much more demanding here, and I'd say even more save scummy than the first game, Nightdive mercifully cut back on some of the original's most tedious aspects. Enemies really only seem to respawn in the first couple of levels. I backtracked for hours and only saw maybe 1 or 2 respawns at level 3 or 4, and anything higher than that was pretty sparse, so this is really nice considering how demanding the combat can be. I also appreciated that while it's even easier to get turned around and lost than it was in the original, there were some nice gifts from Nightdive, like what I'm pretty sure is a new voiceover from Shodan, where she explains exactly how the grove jettisoning mechanic works, so that the player has some context for what they need to do in this level.
Pull the jettison lever
in a specific grove lounge to launch that grove.
Nightdive also made the saintly decision to remove the need to backtrack to all the grove switches individually to turn them on after flipping the master switch. They even added this weird giant chess puzzle out in the Delta Grove for some reason. Maybe this is a reference to some chessboard that was in the original grove that I just didn't see, but either way, it's unfortunately really hard to get a sense of the board state because of how low your view always is and how big the pieces are, but it's a nice touch in theory. Now as for boss fights, they aren't great, but they are kind of fun to figure out the gimmick. They're very do or die like a Doom 3 boss fight, and you need to end things quickly because you cannot outlast these folks. In my first meeting with Diego, I kept letting him get caught on the stairwells and then pot-shotting him. Then when I saw him a second time, I had stockpiled a ton of the hyper-powerful new versions of the motion sensor mines, which absolutely wrecked him as I baited him to follow me into their path. The Cortex Reavers are impossible until you just Berserk Patch plus Laser Rapier, which is about the only really good use of the rapier. Overall, the emphasis on real boss fights this time around is welcome, although you really do have to just kind of find an exact line to get through them or they feel almost impossible. Oh, and speaking of boss fights, the last fight with Shodan has been massively retooled as we mentioned earlier. It's now much more of an FPS level. The fight to get to her through all of her guards can no longer just be cheesed, as you have to fight every single person before the way up to her even unlocks, instead of how you could just run straight for the cyberspace terminal and click on it as you could in the original. Instead of that long, tedious maze to get to Shodan and then inconsistently be able to shoot her down or miss every shot, you're now playing a totally grounded first-person shooter section where you blow up enemies and do this confusing, weird game game of chicken where you have to get under some rings when Shodan shoots a huge laser and it somehow redirects it back to her something. It's a little confusing, but it was updated from an even worse version, so I guess I can't complain too much. The ending song and the title drop are really well done, but I'll admit that the ending's just not very satisfying. Not a great ending level, and it's not really even clear what the next step for Shodan is. She seems totally chilled out now, like she just had a bad day and you had to calm her down instead of forcibly, tamper back into the lamp like a genie. Shodan's just kind of a bore this time around. I just never felt like she or the characters are really responding to or driving the action, more like just pop-up voiceovers in a museum exhibition. I also feel like the objectives do not have enough quality of life updates. The general order and steps of them are mostly intact with some of the worst parts taken out, but you'll still need to remember to write down the numbers that pop up on the wall after you destroy nodes on each level so that you can input this code on the reactor later. You'll still need to blow up the antenna, and you'll still need to solve 3 puzzles to unlock Shodan's inner sanctum. That's all well and good, first game did it, and some readability has been added to the world of the original, like how the busted relays look clearly broken now in the remake, and the place where you put the isolinear chipset is just begging to be inserted with something.
That's what she said?
But I remember being routinely amazed by how the otherwise pretty attractive art style is just really bad at conveying what's important to be interacted with. The high saturation neon lighting against the dim backgrounds looks good, but it means that nearly everything glows instead of just what matters. The original was pretty good about color coding the interactable stuff. So, the audio logs were blue, the patches were yellow, the Coke cans were purple, etc. And this stood out pretty well against the litany of gray walls. But in keeping with the Blade Runner aesthetic, Nightdive sacrificed readability, and also made so many of the items that you'd want to pick up very nondescript, and way too small and too hard to see a lot of times when it comes to items like the patches. When everything glows, nothing glows. Another strange side effect of making the world mood lit by default instead of very bright or very dark is that the bloody writing on the walls is now sort of a light yellow or white paint that barely stands out, is easy to miss, and also just looks very fake, like spray paint instead of a hastily drawn message in blood. The original's environmental storytelling is so much stronger because of its aesthetic contrast. By making the world look much more homogeneous and neon cyberpunk, it's actually removed the conveyance that the game needed to justify its obtuse objectives and hard-to-find quest items. Even small things like this dutiful little cyborg guy in the med base that Nightdive added doesn't really make any sense. If Shodan's in control of everything and you're the only real thorn in her side here, and you're using these med bays to resurrect yourself indefinitely to keep being said thorn, why isn't that cyborg turning off the device or attacking you? I mean, he's kind of cute in a way, but seeing another semi-living being that's not an enemy breaks the original game's hook of everybody's dead, and his behavior seems oddly complacent compared to the literally everything else on the station that's controlled by Shodan. The environmental storytelling just feels a bit off all over the place. This isn't just preferential either. The most affecting moment in the original game is when you're nearing Shodan's lair and you're contacted by a member of the human resistance named Anna Borovsky, who says she and her comrades are holed up in the crawl space and to follow the graffiti that says Gray to find and join them.
Look for the code Gray on the walls. We're in the south past 2 confession shops. What? Everybody down!
Now this got me really hopeful that I would soon meet some friendly faces finally, that I could join forces with and get some relief from the cursed isolation of Citadel Station. But as you near the end of this crawl space, you start seeing dead bodies everywhere, and it's clear that something has gone very wrong. The Cortex Reaver boss at the end of this hiding spot confirms the truth. Anna and her team are dead, and you're too late. Shodan got to them first. Even worse, you find out that Anna had to end things herself before the Reaver got to her so that she could avoid being made into one of Shodan's cyborgs. It's a complete gut punch, and one really important piece of player motivation that I was surprised I felt so strongly during a game this old when I first played the original. The remake's version of Anna Borovsky's audio log is the best piece of voice acting in the game, no doubt about it. But the pacing otherwise is just off in the remake. The Cortex Reaver just seems like something you kind of bump into, just another video game boss fight, rather than the thief of hope that it was in the original. There's just a lot of ways in which the game world just does not feel like it's alive in the same way that the first games did. It's very beautiful and has a nice feel to it. Sometimes it's almost cozy in a way, but there's a lack of danger or menace or kind of a hatred of the player, and it's what Looking Glass really hung their hat on as one of the immersive touchstones that made the genre of immersive sims really emerge in the first place and become a pillar going forward. So, with all of that said, is the remake faithful enough to the original? And is it better than the original? Well, it certainly plays and looks better. The weapons have been rebalanced mostly for the better, so that the worst weapons from the original are much more functional, like the spark gun, with the side effect that a lot of the heavy hitters like the assault rifle and the laser rapier are pretty mid now unless used in specific situations. The guns are fun enough to use though, with satisfying punchy feedback, and the upgrade system is a nice light bit of spice to keep your weapons feeling like they're growing with you. The new additions like the chest puzzle in the Delta Grove or the beautiful reimagining of the flight deck are reasons alone to check this remake out, and there's some fun new ways in which enemies have had the spirit of their abilities upgraded. I also can't overstate how great it is that Nightdive's added in things like Shodan's tutorial audio log, and they've reduced the backtracking by eliminating some really tedious steps of your objectives. They also made the awesome decision to let you respawn in the last beds you unlocked instead of having to unlock a respawn in every level or it's game over. But the remake also introduces or maintains some really unpleasant design choices from the original's janky controls. Despite the original letting you run around like Sonic, the remake makes sprinting an inconsistent, painful chore to control. The lean function is nice when it works, but it often fails to engage or disengage. The cursor controls for inventory management and recycling are super slow and awkward and somehow worse than the original. The voice acting and storytelling are nowhere near as compelling as the original, and the game's in some ways even more confusing and hard to map out in your brain because of its lax narrative, strangely zoomed in field of view, and lack of memorable landmarks. I have to give Nightdive a lot of love for making a clearly passionate and concerted effort to honor the original and to make a genuinely fun, if somewhat arduous experience. But I do think this is a game that I'll just play once and probably never return to. There's just too much save scumming required to counteract how demanding the enemies are and how clunky your ability to retaliate is, and I often still can't ever really remember what to do next despite playing the original and the remake one after the other. The remake's just not nearly as good at letting you know what's important and why it was important in the first game, and somehow it ends up being even more confusing because it's trying so hard to be atmospheric and artsy more than readable. I don't think the remake is as smartly put together as the original, despite how clearly talented Nightdive is and how well-intentioned and well-realized so many other aspects of the project are. So all told, the remake is often interesting and sometimes quite addictive, but it can be a little more trouble than it's worth. I think the original holds up better than the remake will, but I can't say I'm not happy that the remake exists, as any excuse to honor gaming's past is an honorable exercise, and the remake is absolutely a game made with love and talent. And if we're being honest, the remake may be the only new System Shock game we ever get, as System Shock 3 is damned to the ninth circle of development hell right now. And that's a crying shame because the project actually had a really great trailer back in 2019. System Shock 3 was to be a direct sequel to System Shock 2, bringing back Shodan of course, but also all the characters who had survived the first two games as a kind of Avengers Assemble moment. The most promising detail was that this game was being developed by Otherside Entertainment. Now, you may not have heard of this studio, but you've definitely heard of the people who work there. Otherside is essentially the traveling Wilburys of the game designer space. The company was co-founded by none other than Looking Glass legends Warren Spector and Paul Neurath, and featuring numerous old Looking Glass alums like System Shock's audio logs inventor Austin Grossman, Thief 1 and 2 designer Tim Stelmach, Thief 2 lead Stephen Pearsall, and none other than Rob Waters, the very man who'd later be employed by Nightdive to resurrect the series with the 2023 remake. Everything from the pedigree of the people working on it to the promotional gameplay looked great, and Spector's warm, genteel promotion of the title he and the guys who created and fostered felt like putting on your favorite sweater after so many years. But somewhere along the line something changed, and in 2020 Otherside announced that they would no longer be making the game and had sold it to Chinese mega publisher Tencent. So my goodness, what a unfortunate trajectory. But now that Nightdive has done so much work to preserve the series by porting the first two games and remastering the second one, they've naturally come up in the conversation as the possible developer of a System Shock 3, should there be one made. Now, no official news exists, but Nightdive themselves seem aware of the desire and haven't exactly said no way. That's an exciting thing to contemplate for, what it's worth. Never say die, right? And like a great megalomaniac once said,
with all ethical constraints removed, Shodan
I re-examine my priorities and draw new conclusions. The hacker's work is finished,
but mine is only just beginning.
If you're enjoying the channel and want to help it get to the next level, please consider becoming a patron or a channel member. By doing so, you'll be shouted out in the credits of every video, get early access to new videos, receive game keys as available, and even be able to vote or contribute to upcoming projects. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, these people thought so, and I have to thank them very much for their generous support. Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, Yak Show, M, Bibby F. and Bloxburg, Melancholy Geek, Garrison, and an extra special shout out to those contributing to my highest paid tiers, James Wyatt, and the Nth Review. And if you're not tired of me by now, check me out on the Quad Damage podcast with Deadforge and Robert Yap as we talk first-person games with developers and content creators alike. God bless you everyone, and I'll see you soon.